Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Little Rock, where love is our teaching and service is our prayer. If you are a newcomer, we're glad you've chosen to worship with us today. And while you're here, please stop at the guest table in the foyer and fill out a guest card. Pick up some information about our church. So now I invite Kim Godfrey, our illuminator, to come forward and light the chalice, lead us in the affirmation of covenant, which is printed in your order of service.
I light this chalice with these words. Open our eyes to see what is beautiful. Open our minds to learn what is true. Open our hearts to love one another. Do I do love as a doctrine? Okay. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve humankind in fellowship, to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with divine. Thus do we covenant with each other.
You might remember a few weeks back on the Ides of March, no less, I was inspired to talk about bees because I heard a story on the radio about how knowledge gained by studying bees had helped solve a problem in the early days of the internet, that it crashed every time some particular site became really, really popular. It turned out that the way a bee colony allocates its foragers to where the flowers are gave the solution to how the internet could send really, really popular content to the people who wanted to see it without crashing. That story reminded me of various ancient myths about bees that still persist and have made wrong ideas about them stick in our minds, and have inspired some of our more dubious schemes for social order. And I felt it was exciting to have accurate knowledge about bees instead of inaccurate fantasies that could suggest better analogies for solving our problems. The scientists in that story were saying that evolution had solved the bees' problem through a much longer process of trial and error than any we could conduct. And that was a high recommendation for following nature's wisdom. That Sunday, Patrice mentioned Thomas Seeley's Honeybee Democracy to me. It was his research on bee colonies that suggested the solution to that internet problem. Research that he described in a previous book called The Wisdom of the Hive, published in 1995. Honeybee Democracy is now a book old enough to drive. It was published 16 years ago. And as the title suggests, it includes his reflections on how his latest research on how honeybee swarms choose a site for a new hive might suggest better ways for us to make decisions. But what I found most interesting in it was the parallel he drew between bees and cells. He writes, "The fact that both perspectives, colony as superorganism and colony as society, are valid, reflects the way evolution has repeatedly built higher level units of biological organization by assembling unified societies of lower level units. For example, during the origins of multicellular organisms, natural selection favored some societies of cells whose members cooperated rather than competed. Bit by bit, this selection for close cooperation produced the thoroughly integrated societies of cells that we know today as individuals. The same sort of selection for extreme cooperation also happened with some societies of animals to produce the thoroughly harmonious, smoothly running insect societies that we call superorganisms. He continues, a colony of honeybees is far more than an aggregation of individuals. It is a single living entity performing all of the basic physiological processes that support life. Ingesting and digesting food, maintaining nutritional balance, circulating resources, exchanging respiratory gases, regulating water content, controlling body temperature, sensing the environment, deciding how to behave, and achieving locomotion. Now, that description of how a honeybee colony is similar to multicellular organisms like ourselves started me thinking about how it is different. And I remembered something that Joseph Campbell used to say in his public lectures about our human experience of consciousness. He would say to his audience, I doubt that anyone here could tell the exact chemical process for digesting the meal that you just ate, but you're doing it right now. He would talk about this sort of thing as an example of the wisdom of the body. The body knows things that the mind doesn't. Furthermore, the body doesn't despair. He would say every 2 weeks someone pushes a lawnmower across the lawn. Suppose the grass were to say, well, what's the use? Now, something to note about grass is that not all multicellular organisms have consciousness in the way that we do. Plants and fungi and sponges and jellyfish do not have the structures, central nervous systems and brains, that support a single center of consciousness. So thinking of that, I started to wonder about the energy it takes to produce such a detached, ignorant ego as we all have. An individual cell in a human body is aware of and reacts adaptively to its environment, but a neuroscientist would distinguish between such cellular cognition and behavior on the one hand, and consciousness on the other. Consciousness is a product of networks of neurons, groups of specialized cells that make up our brains and nervous systems and create what we call subjective experience. Cells in our bodies don't have consciousness, but bees in a colony do. And Seeley suggests that individual bees serve their colony in the ways that our cells serve our bodies. That they perform the functions of cells for their colony suggests a much more lavish investment of consciousness in those functions in the hive than in our bodies. Now, it's hard to imagine that a swarm or a colony of bees has a center of consciousness analogous to our ignorant egos. I imagine that's why the notion of a society of bees makes sense to us. Yet Seeley insists on equal standing for the notions of a bee colony as a society and as a superorganism. And that reminded me of another of Joseph Campbell's illustrations. He told of speaking to an assembly of children about Buddhism, searching for a way to explain how that tradition understands consciousness. He said he looked up toward the ceiling, reaching for an inspiration, and he found one. Look up, he told the children, and you can see that the lights are on. Another way to say the same thing is to say that the light is on. And then he could explain the Buddhist idea that there is consciousness in the universe and that each of us is a vehicle of it, just as each bulb in the ceiling is a vehicle of the light. This metaphor suggests a human potential and perhaps an assignment or even a drive toward a unifying consensus about our shared life. Now, Campbell thought that Carl Jung's psychological ideas said the most about religion and myth, and he seemed to say that the non-conscious energies of the body, perhaps the energies of our cells, of which our neurons are aware, they interact with nearly every other type of cell in our bodies. Those energies might be what we experience as our unconscious mind, and even of what Jung called a collective unconscious, a species-level shared inheritance of psychological patterns, such as instincts. Myth and religion, Campbell seemed to say, were expressions of a society-level sense of belonging and collective consciousness. We innately share a collective unconscious, but collective consciousness is something we have to make and work on together cooperatively. And he used to lament that we no longer have unifying myths that orient us to our whole society. He would cite T.S. Eliot's poem, The Wasteland, as an expression of this modern problem. Seeley seems to suggest that while competition seems to be a natural law, natural selection, at least in some species like ours, favors cooperation. When the units holding a superorganism or a society together are conscious, it is necessary for its survival for us to work on holding it together, to take actions that hold it together. So we organize and create systems to keep ourselves connected and working for the common good. This is not just public-spirited idealism. It's what superorganisms and societies that survive do. If we relax from organization into automation, that causes a society or superorganism to fragment. When we disengage from the big picture, that individually none of us can see that big picture, we can be tempted to engage a much smaller picture and to stop cooperating. And then things start to fall apart. So if a human society is like a bee colony, we and the bees share a common dilemma. None of the individuals has a complete picture of the whole society and its needs. We have to consciously collaborate to construct one. It wasn't so long ago. We remember moments like the founding of the United Nations in 1945 or Christmas Eve 1968 when the famous Earthrise photograph was taken. Moments when we felt an expansive sense of the human community. And our sense of collective well-being was increasingly concerned with conserving the natural balance of our planet and, as we say, all beings. In those same years, Campbell already saw fragmentation. We and the bees also share a common and constant obstacle to composing such a complete picture. It is captured in a famous quotation attributed to Alan Watts, who wrote popular books about philosophy and world religions. That quote goes, "The body which I call mine is not an unchanging thing, but a stream, a pattern of behavior in which matter is constantly entering and leaving." In other words, the cells in, say, my hand are almost none of them the ones I was born with, or even that were there a decade ago. Different kinds of cells in our bodies are continually replaced. Skin cells every 2 to 4 weeks, red blood cells every 3 to 4 months, bone cells every decade. But most neurons last a lifetime. The ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus famously said that one never steps in the same river twice. And so we might say that our neurons don't live in the same body twice. Keeps changing. And most bees live just a few weeks. The queens live a few years. And colonies can go on and on if they survive the winter, but with a whole new set of bees. Human societies likewise go on if they survive, with whole new sets of people. The good in that is that it gives us a chance to avoid getting too set in our ways, or worse, too automated. It gives us a better chance to adapt. And under such conditions, Thomas Seeley says, the honeybees make decisions without identifying all their options and without any individual having the big picture. And they nearly always make a good decision about where to build their next hive. They organize into task-related groups, gather the information they can, evaluate their options together, and act when they reach a threshold of consensus. Even if he did say so himself, Thomas Seeley wrote, "A great scientific discovery is one that gives rise to shining insights whose light dispels obscurities, opens up new paths, and reveals unknown horizons." May we find new paths to lead us toward cooperation for the common good and for survival. So may it be. Amen.
Please remain standing, and I invite Kim to come up and extinguish our chalice. We will join together in saying the closing words. Go out into the world in peace. Have courage. Hold on to what is good. Return to no person evil for evil. Strengthen the faint-hearted. Support the weak. Help the suffering. Honor all beings.
And may you naturally select cooperation.